The wind had no mercy in the mountains of North Korea. It screamed across the barren hills, biting through wool and skin alike, turning every breath into a frozen dagger. Sergeant Jack Corrigan adjusted his collar and squinted into the gray-white horizon. Snowflakes drifted in lazy spirals, but there was nothing peaceful about the scene. He and his men, 34 Marines of Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Regiment, were advancing north toward the Chosin Reservoir, unaware they were marching into a trap. Private Luis Ramirez stumbled slightly, boots crunching in the snow as he caught up to Corrigan. He was young, barely old enough to shave, with hands that trembled more from fear than cold. Corrigan glanced at him, not unkindly. "You keep your eyes up, Ramirez," Corrigan said. "This ain't Texas." Ramirez nodded, lips blue and cracking. "Yes, Sergeant." In truth, none of them were prepared for this. They'd trained for combat, but nothing in boot camp had mirrored this place. Temperatures that dropped below -30, terrain that rose like a jagged scar across the land, and an enemy that remained invisible. Orders were clear. Advance to the Yalu River, crush what remained of the North Korean forces, and be home by Christmas. That's what the higher-ups believed. Corrigan wasn't so sure. Back at division headquarters in Hagaru-ri, General Edward Almond outlined the next phase of the offensive with theatrical optimism. He waved his gloved hands over a map, tracing the roads toward the reservoir. His voice, muffled by the thick canvas of the tent, carried the unmistakable tone of overconfidence. "Push through." "The Chinese won't dare cross the border," he said, but they already had. Over 100,000 Chinese troops had slipped silently through the mountains, hidden by night and terrain, lying in wait. Under the command of General Song Shi-lun, the People's Volunteer Army had orders to annihilate the American X-Corps. Mao Zedong himself had approved the plan. The cold, the terrain, and surprise were their weapons, and soon they would be wielded with brutal precision. In a frost-covered bunker overlooking the eastern ridge, Chinese infantryman Wei Lan crouched beside his squad leader, watching the distant silhouettes of American troops inch closer. He was only 21, from a village in Sichuan, and had never fired his weapon in combat. His hands were wrapped in rags, but they still bled. The commander had told them, "Attack when the moon was highest, and do not stop until the enemy was destroyed." Wei didn't hate the Americans. He didn't understand them, but he believed in the mission, or at least he told himself he did. Corrigan's column paused at a narrow pass near Toktong. He raised his fist, signaling a halt. Something in the silence felt wrong. The snowfall had stopped, but the sky remained heavy with menace. Ramirez crouched behind a rock, scanning the ridges. Not a bird, not a rustle, just silence, and the faint metallic groan of ice shifting in the distance. Corporal Teddy Hoyle, Corrigan's second-in-command, knelt beside him. "You feel that?" Corrigan nodded. "Yeah, too quiet, like the world's holding its breath." Still, the orders were clear. They had to keep moving, establish a perimeter near the reservoir, and await further command. Corrigan hated it. The road was exposed, the hills were high and close. If he were ambushing a force, this is where he'd do it. As night fell, the temperature plunged even lower. Tents refused to stay upright. Rations turned to bricks. Ramirez's fingers went numb as he tried to load his rifle. Nearby, a Marine slipped and cracked his knee on a rock. He didn't scream, just groaned and bit down hard on his scarf. Pain was one thing. Drawing attention was another. Corrigan walked the perimeter before sleep, his boots crunching softly. He saw faces in the firelight, some hardened, some haunted, all tired. He paused beside Ramirez, who sat hunched over, cradling his weapon like it might slip away. "You done good today," Corrigan said. "Keep your head down tomorrow. It'll get worse before it gets better." Ramirez looked up, eyes wide in the firelight. "How bad?" Corrigan didn't answer. Instead, he nodded once and moved on. Several miles away, Wei Lan cleaned his rifle with trembling hands. His squad leader muttered something about the gods favoring the cold. The entire battalion was set to move under cover of darkness. They would climb into those hills, form a noose around the enemy, and tighten it with fire and steel. Wei closed his eyes and tried to imagine home, his sister's laughter, the sound of rice steaming. But the cold pulled him back. There was no warmth left in this place, only the promise of blood. At midnight, the moon rose high and round above the snow-covered hills. Corrigan sat upright in his foxhole, scanning the shadows. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it, the kind of gut-deep warning that years of service had honed into instinct. Then came the sound. Not gunfire, not shouts, just the first crackle of movement in the snow, a shift in the wind, a whisper carried from the ridge. Then a flare burst overhead, red and cruel, and all hell followed behind. Machine gun fire erupted from the hills. Mortar shells crashed into the valley. Shadows, dozens, then hundreds, rushed down from the ridgeline screaming in Mandarin. Corrigan grabbed his rifle and shouted, "Contact! Contact! To the ridge!" Ramirez froze for a heartbeat, then scrambled behind a rock, firing wildly. Marines shouted orders, dragged wounded comrades, returned fire into the darkness. Wei Lan ran with his battalion, breath steaming, heart pounding. The Americans were surprised, but they were fighting back hard. A man beside him dropped without a sound. Another stumbled. But the commanders had said, "Charge until you can touch them. Do not stop." As the valley lit with racer rounds and the air filled with screams and explosions, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir had begun. In the cold and darkness, with no end in sight, two armies collided in a frozen crucible neither had fully understood. And for Corrigan, Ramirez, and Wei Lan, survival would become a matter not just of strength, but of soul. Snow erupted in waves as the Chinese charge crashed against the American line. Fox Company's position buckled under the sheer weight of bodies, yet it held, barely. Corrigan barked orders over the rattle of gunfire, his voice hoarse but resolute. Around him, muzzle flashes illuminated frozen faces, blood steaming in the Arctic air. Ramirez fired in short, panicked bursts, barely controlling the recoil, ears ringing with chaos. Somewhere behind him, a man screamed, a sound quickly drowned out by the next mortar blast. The attack had lasted 6 hours before it ebbed, the ground littered with bodies, some twisted in the snow like broken marionettes. No one spoke much during the lull. They checked magazines, changed bandages, redug foxholes. Corrigan moved like a man half frozen and half dreaming. He could feel the frostbite chewing at his fingers, but more urgently, he felt the weight of his men's eyes. They were watching him, waiting for a sign they'd get out of this alive. "I need a runner," Corrigan muttered. His voice was cracked and dry, barely rising above a whisper. Ramirez stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "I'll go, Sergeant." Corrigan hesitated. Ramirez had proved himself the night before, but a supply run through that killing field was a death sentence in disguise. Still, they needed ammo, morphine, word from Hagaru-ri, anything. "Keep your head down," Corrigan said, gripping Ramirez's shoulder. "If it moves, shoot it. If it doesn't move, shoot it twice." Ramirez nodded, face hardening, and disappeared into the trees. The wind picked up again, curling around the ridgeline like a beast. Far above the Marine position, Wei Lan crouched in a dugout, clutching his rifle with white-knuckled tension. The attack had failed to break through, and now his unit was regrouping. The dead were everywhere, frozen where they fell, some still clutching grenades. His commanding officer barked about discipline and sacrifice, but Wei saw doubt clouding the eyes of the soldiers around him. They were not trained like the Americans, not armored, and not fed. They were farmers, students, conscripts, and they were dying by the thousands. That night, the second assault came, this time coordinated, multi-pronged, and louder. Bugles howled like wolves from the tree line, signaling wave after wave of infantry. The Chinese emerged with bayonets gleaming under moonlight, charging through gunfire with terrifying resolve. Corrigan's men held the line at a cost. A dozen wounded, 4 dead, and a collapsing northern flank. Every inch of snow was contested with bullets and blood. Ramirez returned bruised and gasping, one sleeve soaked in crimson. He had crawled most of the way back, dragging a crate of ammunition behind him. Corrigan didn't ask about the wound, just handed him a canteen and went back to work reinforcing the line. Every hour bled into the next. Sleep came in 30-second bursts, interrupted by screams or the sound of incoming shells. Frostbite spread like ink stains across fingers and toes. One Marine collapsed from exhaustion and never woke up. Another had to have his boots cut off, his feet blackened and rigid. At the command post near Hagaruri, General Smith stared at the battlefield reports with a frown carved from granite. His units were surrounded, the roads were impassable, and air support was limited by weather. Yet he refused to panic. "We're not retreating," he told his staff. "We're attacking in another direction." It became the ethos of the campaign. Withdraw, not in fear, but in defiance. Corrigan received the new orders before dawn. They were to fight south, break through enemy lines, and regroup at Hagaruri. It was a march of over 30 miles through mountains under constant attack. Every man knew what it meant, and none questioned it. "We hold Toktong Pass," Corrigan told his squad. "If we lose that road, nobody gets out. We die here, or we die later." Ramirez nodded, jaw clenched. He had changed. The fear was still there, but now it was tempered by a soldier's instinct: fight, survive, protect the man beside you. He had seen friends die and watched the eyes of those who kept going. War had carved something permanent into him. At dawn, Fox Company prepared their position. They dug deeper, laid out fields of fire, melted snow for water, and wrapped the wounded in whatever cloth remained. Then they waited. The Chinese attacked again, more furiously than before. Wei Lan rushed forward with the wave, heart hammering. Machine gun fire cut into their lines, dropping men like stalks of wheat. Wei dived behind a boulder, rifle clutched tight, his face stinging with icy sweat. The screams around him were deafening. He couldn't see who was dying, only that they were. He raised his weapon, fired into the blinding light, and kept moving. Corrigan fired until his rifle jammed, then grabbed another from a dead comrade. His eyes were rimmed with frost. His voice cracked from shouting, but he didn't stop. Neither did his men. As the sun dipped again behind the mountains, the snow turned red in long streaks. Silence returned, but not peace. Only the exhausted pause before the next assault. Corrigan found Ramirez sitting behind a shattered log, breathing hard. Blood streaked his cheek. Corrigan sat beside him, neither man speaking. In the stillness, they listened, to the wind, to the creak of trees heavy with ice, to the distant sound of men digging trenches with frozen hands. "We're still here," Corrigan finally said. Ramirez didn't respond right away. Then quietly, "For how long?" Corrigan didn't answer. The question lingered in the cold air between them. Far on the other side of the ridge, Wei Lan lay beside the shattered remnants of his squad. Only 4 of them were left. Orders were to regroup and attack again at midnight. He stared into the sky, stars flickering like frozen sparks. He wondered what it was all for. The Battle of Chosin was far from over, but already it had become something else entirely. It was no longer about flags or territory. It was about endurance, survival, the soul of every man buried beneath snow and silence. By the 3rd week, the cold no longer bit, it devoured. Temperatures plunged to -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel snapped like twigs. Eyelashes froze shut. Medics couldn't use morphine ampules because they had turned to ice. Every breath came with a cost, and yet Fox Company moved. Corrigan led his men down the treacherous mountain path that wound like a vein through enemy territory. Behind them lay Tong Pass, secured after 8 days of relentless siege. In front loomed the gauntlet to Harrowing. Trucks were few. Most walked, dragging sleds with the wounded wrapped in bloodied ponchos. They moved silently, haunted. Words wasted energy. Their boots crunched over frozen corpses, enemy and friend, indistinguishable in the white shroud. Ramirez walked with a limp, the wound in his leg hastily stitched and frozen solid. He had refused evacuation. Pride, perhaps, or guilt. He watched the horizon like a hawk, finger poised near the trigger of his frost-covered rifle. Corrigan knew the look. Ramirez had crossed the threshold. The boy who trembled in foxholes was gone. What remained was a soldier. The Chinese struck at night, the moment darkness cloaked the column. Wei Lan was among them, now promoted to squad leader after his commander bled out on a ridge. He had stopped asking why they fought. Orders came. He obeyed. He no longer recognized the face in his reflection when ice-covered puddles showed it. Each attack was more desperate. Ammunition was scarce, food non-existent. His unit was down to knives, grenades, and what few bullets remained. As the Americans descended the narrow Funchalen Pass, the Chinese sprang their trap. Explosives shattered the lead vehicle, and gunfire rained from the cliffs above. Chaos rippled through the column. Corrigan threw himself behind a rock, barking orders. "Suppress the ridge! Move the wounded down the line!" Ramirez crawled forward, cradling his rifle like a lifeline. He picked targets in the dark, flashes of movement lit by tracer fire. Around him, Marines screamed. One man clutched his stomach, entrails steaming against the snow. A medic yanked him back by the collar, leaving a crimson trail. From above, Wei Lan hurled a grenade, its pin biting his palm. The explosion rocked the path, sending soldiers sprawling. He caught sight of the Americans' tenacity, how they refused to break, even here, even now. He admired it in a strange, detached way, just as he loathed the starvation gnawing at his ribs. Corrigan grabbed a bazooka from a fallen comrade and fired blindly toward the ridge. The missile struck a tree line, sending splinters and bodies flying. The pause was enough. "Go!" he roared. "Keep moving! No one stops!" For hours, the battle raged along the frozen corridor. Marines dragged each other through snowdrifts. Chinese soldiers leapt from trees in suicidal desperation. Flamethrowers hissed, grenades popped like thundercracks, and tracer rounds lit the night like fireworks. At dawn, the guns fell quiet. The dead lay thick across the pass. Corrigan found Ramirez crouched over a fallen Marine, eyes glassy, hands trembling. He said nothing, just touched his shoulder. The bond between them, forged in fire and frost, needed no words. They reached Harrowing 3 days later, frost-bitten and ragged. Aircraft roared overhead, dropping supplies in parachuted bundles. The perimeter buzzed with life, bulldozers clearing snow, radio operators relaying coordinates, medics triaging the half-dead. The retreat was not over. Udom still waited beyond the hills, and the path to Hungnam remained blocked, but the worst was behind them. In a tent reeking of antiseptic and diesel, Corrigan sat beside Ramirez, who finally allowed the medics to dress his leg properly. Outside, the wind howled, but the tent offered something close to warmth. Corrigan lit a cigarette with shaking hands, offering one to Ramirez. "We made it," the young soldier said. Corrigan nodded slowly. "Not all of us." Wei Lan watched the Americans from a distant ridge, his unit reduced to 8 men, most too weak to stand. Orders had come again. Prepare for another assault. He looked down at his frost-bitten fingers and realized he could no longer feel the trigger. In that moment, something within him cracked, like river ice underfoot. He turned away. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir would enter legend, not because of glory or victory, but because of endurance. Of 30,000 United Nations troops, over 15,000 were wounded or killed. The Chinese lost far more, tens of thousands frozen or gunned down. Yet from this hell, the 1st Marine Division emerged intact, bloodied, but unbeaten. For Corrigan, the war did not end in Korea. But something essential had ended in him. Some innocence, or perhaps the belief that war had a purpose beyond survival. Ramirez never forgot the men who didn't make it. He wrote letters for them, returned watches to families, and carried their names with him into every future silence. Wei Lan would survive the war, return to a homeland that barely remembered him. In the quiet of his village, the cold sometimes returned in dreams, and the snow, always the snow, falling soft over memory, over blood, over the silent graves of a frozen hell.